what makes our session very challenging. We are just before the award and the cocktail, so I hope we can enjoy this meeting. This sixth meeting of the day of the Conference on Credit. Welcome, everyone. Let me introduce our panelists. We have 3 panels today, 3 papers that they are going to be presented, and they have some things in common. Not only they are related to great economies like Brazil, United States, and Russia, but also they are related to very important principles of ask. So not only the environmental part of it, but also the social part of it, what bring implications for public policy. So let me introduce our panelists of this panel. We have Tiago Cavalcanti from University of Cambridge with the paper Financing Costs and Development. We have Philippe Tian from Bank of Canada with mortgage put-back risks and lender market power in refinancing. And we have Yanis Skrastins from Washington University in St. Louis with housing and fertility. So our panelists are going also to work to have a role as debaters in each one of the presentations. Our dynamics today is the dynamics of the conference. We are going to have a presentation of 20 minutes of our panelists, followed by 10 minutes of discussions among our debaters, and then we are going to open for 10 more minutes for questions from the audience. And I'm going to help you to keep track of time. Please don't be mad at me if I kindly remind you that we are running out of time. So to start, I would like to invite Tiago Cavalcanti from University of Cambridge.
Hi there. Thank you so much for fitting the paper in the program. And also thank you for the generosity of the central bank for all the resources that the data, and also to work with great economies from the central bank. So this is actually an old project that I have. Hopefully it's going to be published. So this is Financing Costs and Development. So just because of matter of time, I'll try to give the pitch, the takeaway of the paper before going to the slides. So basically the question that we are trying to understand is really about development, right? So why, firms in Brazil, they don't grow, right? And whether the credit market has any role, okay? For the business dynamism in the country, for entry, exit, for the growth of firms and so on, okay? And what we do differently from, the existing literature, right? So far, the existing literature in the macro development literature, they have looked at, how financial frictions, they affect economic development. But most of the time, what they use is what's called hard or credit quantity constraint. Okay? Think about, say, firms, they have an asset and they can leverage from the assets, right, to buy the capital that they have, they use in production, right? So think about this really kind of a quantity constraint, a quantity of capital that the firms, they use in production, right? And once you look in the data, something that's very important from our data is that not only quantity, they are very important, but also the price that the firms, they face are very different. And think about the price here is really the price of the loan, okay? So meaning like the spreads in the interest rate that the firms, they face are very different. And they are very different even trying to account for, say, credit risk. Okay? So even if you try to account for default probabilities of the firm, really firms still, they get loans at very different rates. Okay? So that's really what we explore. We're exploring the data, the credit register data, which is the universe of all loans in Brazil, basically. And we document facts about this data. And then we use this data within, kind of a model of macro development to understand what are the implications of these credit frictions for, kind of firms in Brazil. Okay, so that's basically the paper. So, and, kind of that's really the idea. Think about in a world of perfect credit markets, really, kind of comparative advantage of entrepreneurs, of firms, they are going to allocate the resource. Okay? And this means that the marginal productivity of capital firms, they are going to be equalized. Okay? So when you have a world, when we have the world with credit constraint, this might not happen. Okay? And when you have this quantity constraint, when the leverage constraint is binary, then basically the marginal productivity of capital of some firms are going to be very different. But the price dispersion that we are going to explore is going to generate an additional problem that's, firms directly are going to have different price that they're going to face, and therefore they are going to have different marginal productivity of capital. And the question that we have is, how important are those? So, the data is really, the RISE data, the matched employer-employee data set, and then this is linked with the credit register data, right? And then basically we add these features in a model of economic development, economic growth with firm dynamics, and then we explore, kind of the implications of those. So as we can see, I think I have to look at that. So as we can see, when we isolate, try to, within the model, try to understand the implication, the quantitative implications of financial frictions for economic development, we show, for instance, the financial frictions decrease, long-run GDP per capita in Brazil by about 40%, okay? TFP by about 28%. So you can think about these really kind of very large effects of these financial frictions on the long-run effects on firms. Okay? So that's kind of the implication that we have. And more importantly, right, now it's like I'm thinking about, relating to a literature that already is trying to explore, how financial frictions affect development. Basically, what we show is that the spreads or the dispersion in the spreads that the firms face, they are much more important than the leverage constraint or the quantity constraint. Okay, it's about twice the effects of this quantity constraint. Okay, so something that was not really explored in this literature, we show that it's kind of a very, very important. And not only that, if you want to say reproduce the dynamism of firms in Brazil in terms of entry, exit, and also firm growth, the spreads are super important also to explain this. Okay, so that's kind of the contribution that we have. Okay, so we have highs, right? So that's the data employer-employee linked data set that you can see from size, wage bill, the quality of the workforce, and so on. And we basically link these with the credit register data. So basically, we have the universe of all formal firms in Brazil and also the universe of all loans. So when we observe a loan, then basically we observe the terms of the loan, and then we can observe what happened to the firms after they got the loan. Okay? So we can observe the firm dynamics. And then this is linked by the tax identifier. Okay? So this is kind of one picture that we show. Okay, so this picture here shows the spread. So that's the difference in the loan rate minus the deposit rate, okay, by firm size. Okay, so that's firm size in the left-hand side and age of the firm in the right-hand side. And as you can see, there is kind of a negative relationship, meaning that firms that are smaller, they're paying higher spreads in loans. Okay, of course, this can be driven by default probabilities. But we control for that. We haven't done this yet in the version of the model, but in the previous version of the model that I'm showing here, the gray points there are basically default adjusted, spread adjusted by default costs. And then as you can see, yes, there is, the difference between the black and the gray are larger for small firms. But you can see that still there is, kind of a very large spread that you observe that's not explained by default probabilities. And still, you see this negative relationship there. Okay? When, kind of with regression, we can control for a bunch of other characteristics. Okay? So, and then something that's very important, there is not only one loan. Okay? There are very different loans. There are revolving, right? So there are overdrafts, there are investment, working capital, earned market rates, and so on. So you can see that, kind of not only the level of the spreads are very different, but also the dispersion in the spreads are very different. Okay? And again, this can be, accounted by default probabilities and so on. Okay? Then it's something that we explore. And like this is the composition that's basically mainly driven. If you look at the composition of the spread, you cannot see very well, I think, here. You can see that's mainly that revolving and others here that account for overdrafts, but also working capital, receivables, and investment here. Okay? And that's basically what we use within the model. And then we, we run regressions to try to explain these spreads. Okay? And when we run regression, basically, you cannot really see this, but when you run regression, you control for characteristics that you think that are explained by, the loan, maturity of the loan, the type of the loan, all these things, right? So you can, and also the risk that bank assess for that operation. So when you control for all these things, you explain 40% of the dispersion in the spreads observed in the data. Okay, so there is a bunch of other features that are not really kind of explained by the data. And not only that, once you observe this, even when you observe, then basically you can still show that smaller firms pay a higher, kind of spread, and also younger firms, they also pay higher spreads. Okay? So that's, kind of feature of the data, even if you control for a bunch of characteristics. Okay? So that's the takeaway of really kind of the empirical part. The empirical part, we document facts about the credit market, which is basically a very high spread. And also, not only that, I think we all know that the spreads are very high, but once we got the data, I think for me it was super surprising, is that the dispersion in the interest rates is also pretty high, okay? And it's not really explained by default probability. I mean, some of the parts are explained, of course, by default probability, but not only the whole part explained by default probability. And I'm not taking, a stake here saying, it's all X, it's intermediation cost. I'm not saying it's all, kind of market power of banks. I'm not saying anything. I'm just really explaining some facts here that I think is important for policymakers and also for us to kind of understand, kind of the implication of this interest rate on firm dynamics. Okay, so that's basically the empirical part. Okay, so then there is the model. So let me explain briefly the model. Okay, so I'm not going to get into the details. So the model is about, think about a model where firms, they have idiosyncratic productivity. So each firm has one productivity. They can, hire labor and capital, but when they hire capital, right, they might need to finance the capital. Okay? They can also self-finance. If the interest rates are very high, they can still accumulate assets in the model. Okay? So to overcome, say, financial frictions, firm can actually accumulate assets and then basically, not go to like any kind of bank and basically just self-finance. Okay? But if they go to, kind of external finance, then they can face, kind of interest rate that can vary according to the data with some features that we observe in the data. Okay? And firms can also face a liquidity shock. So we think about, say, this, revolving credit with, kind of a very high interest rate and super large spread. You can think about, most of the times are really kind of short-term spreads with, short maturities and so on. So you can think about a liquidity shock. So you got a project, right? You got a project, you need to produce within, a quarter, and then you need to hire labor and capital, and you don't have working capital, okay? So you go to the bank, and then you have a very high interest rate, and the banks, really get you there, okay? So think about this, and this is what we call, kind of a liquidity shock. Is a different from, you have a productivity, you know that you are going to grow in the future, so you can buy capital. So we all have this within the model, okay? So, not going in the details of the model, and then, kind of the financial friction is really driven by, two features. One is basically limited enforcement that generate this quantity constraint. Remember that I said, the quantity constraint is very important, so we also have this in the model, okay? So the quantity constraint that, the macro literature has explored, we also have that. But we also have intermediation costs, okay? And the intermediation cost that we are going to have here, it's going to be given by a function and really estimated by internally in the model to kind of mimic what you observe in the data. And when we map the data into the model, we basically abstract them. We try to correct as much as we can for default probability, because in our model there is not going to be default in equilibrium. So we consider only loans that are, A and AAA, with no performing loan by firms and so on. So we really kind of try to actually decompose, kind of what comes from risk and what comes from other facts. Okay, so that's what we do. And, that's, kind of the dynamics of the problem. And basically, you can show a little bit, I think there is the intuition of the model. So you can think about assets of the firms, that A, and Z is the productivity of the firm. Okay, think about, the productivity of the firm, and assets is the level of the asset that the firm they have. Okay, so if you have a very high productivity and small asset, you want to grow a lot, right? So you want to grow so much that you might want to go to a bank and actually buy your capital, okay? Because your marginal productivity of capital is very high, okay? So what happened is that if there was no credit market, then basically there is this straight line here. We would split, the area into, say, those that become, open a firm, and those that don't open a firm, they are going to be workers, okay? If credit markets were imperfect. But credit markets are not perfect, okay? And basically what you generate, people that are unconstrained, that the assets are large enough so they are unconstrained, and then the marginal productivity of capital is equal to the interest rate, okay? So there is no misallocation of capital for this U here. This U means unconstrained, okay? For the B, they are borrowers. For the B, they are borrowers. And the farther they are from this, line here, the more credit constrained they are. Okay, meaning that they have lower assets and high productivity. Okay, so they want to grow more, and because they want to grow more, they want to borrow, and they are going to be credit constrained. And this area here would be the extensive margin, right? So entrepreneurs that they have high productivity, but because of access to financial market is limited, then they are not going to access this financial market. Okay, so you can think about extensive margin means allocation. Here will be intensive margin means allocation. Okay, so if you put a quantity constraint, the quantity constraint is not going to affect none of these borrower here. In partial equilibrium, they can affect, of course, in general equilibrium, but not in partial equilibrium. They are going to affect only this region. And that's the region that people in the macro literature, they have been focused all the time, okay? So for the interest of time, I'm going to try to wrap up on the quantitative analysis. So we try to mimic, kind of what we have, in the data, okay? So I'm going to skip the detail how we calibrate the model, but, the model is doing well in the calibration. And then we say, consider a model where you have perfect credit market, and normalize these, GDP to 1 in the perfect credit market. And then put the frictions that you observe in Brazil, that's the benchmark. And then as you can see, GDP falls by 39%, okay? And actually TFP falls by 28%. And all you can see the other effects here. And then you say, suppose now that there is no dispersion in the interest rate, and the dispersion here, that is still a spread. You keep the same size of the credit market, so the credit market is still 32% of GDP, but firms, they pay, when they borrow, they are going to borrow at the same rate for the same default probability, okay? So that's what we have there. And once you have that, you can see, the effect, of no dispersion in the interest rate is almost the same, the whole effect you're observing the benchmark, okay? So the dispersion in this interest rate is really killing the growth of firms because, it's really hitting the firms that are smaller with low assets that they want to grow faster, okay? And when you have only the quantity constraint, right, the quantity constraint, leverage constraint that I talk about in the introduction, and then you can see the effect, is half of the way that what you observe kind of for the node dispersion here, okay? So I'm going to actually skip and leave for discussion, okay? So this is, really kind of empirical facts about credit markets, firms in Brazil showing large, high, and very dispersed spreads that cannot be accounted by default probabilities. And we show that this is super important, right, for the firm dynamics that you observe in the Brazilian market, and also quantitatively for GDP and also TFP and other, kind of wages and so on. Okay, so that's it.
Thank you, Thiago. Now I invite Phoebe Tian as a debater for your comments and questions on this paper.
Okay, first of all, very honored to to discuss this paper. Full disclosure here, I'm not a macroeconomist and I'm not in the field of development as well. But I have to say this paper answered the question I long had as a macroeconomist, as a financial economist, which is how important is financing costs? We have done all the work modeling spread, financing costs, but really how important it is. And I think this paper provides a high quality answer to that question, which I really appreciate. So a quick summary of this paper. This paper tries to look at the implication of financing costs on development and firm dynamics. And it do so in a unique context of Brazil business loan market, which features strikingly high financing spread. To someone who hasn't heard of it before, the 77 percentage point is really a jaw-dropping number for me. And it gets lower for older and larger firms, but not by much. It also documents high dispersion of the spreads, and that's mainly driven by the credit types and firm characteristics. And then this paper developed a model of credit-constrained entrepreneurs with financing spreads. These spreads arise from intermediation costs. The intermediation costs vary with firm asset and productivity, as well as the type of credit. So the way the model works is that high financing spreads dynamically affect firms' ability to self-finance through first asset accumulation, and second, their incentive to save. And then this is going to result in misallocation, and it is most distorting for young firms. Their quantitative results indicate very large impact from financing spread. It is significantly larger than the impact from the quantity constraint, which is previously studied in the literature. And for me, the takeaway number is this 28% drop in TFP, which is really, really large. So let me begin by talking about what I like about this paper. I like this paper a lot. So first of all, I think they asked the right question. But whether you should tell me the right question is half of the success of a good paper. This is the right question to ask because it is very important for both academic literature and for policymakers. Because financing costs are previously overlooked in the literature on the effect of financing constraints. And their results are also highly relevant for policymakers, not only in Brazil, but across the world. In fact, I wish similar work could be done on Canadian data, because we care about productivity a lot recently. And I also like their empirical analysis. The work is done well, and it's done with high-quality administrative data. So the credit registry covers the universe of the corporate loans, and it's matched with employee information. Both are very hard to get. And the analysis is the analysis gave us very clear indicators, and it also covers a comprehensive set of factors Especially, it allows very rich fixed effective specifications in the regression analysis. And the general equilibrium model they developed has this heterogeneous financing spread. And what I like about the model setup is that it's very connected with empirical findings, very well motivated. And it captures the key forces that financing costs have on entrepreneurship and the macroeconomy. And lastly, the results are pretty striking. It makes us to rethink the role of frictions that give rise to high borrowing costs. Okay. I'm going to talk about 3 main comments and 2 minor comments. The first comment I have is the interpretation of the intermediation cost. The specification of the intermediation cost is pretty novel, and it delivers many key results. In the paper, this cost is interpreted by, first, the bank needs to collect borrower information, and second, it needs to monitor the borrower, and lastly, it can help enforce the credit contracts. I have 3 questions on this interpretation. First, why do these activities depend on firms' asset and productivity? Why is it more costly to intermediate when the borrower has lower asset and productivity? Is it because of the opaqueness of information, or is it related to the screening process? So I hope there's more clarification of that. And second, if this is help to enforce credit contracts, then does it interact with the limited enforcement constraint? Because if the bank can enforce the contract by incurring this cost, then why do we need limited enforcement constraint? And lastly, I guess from an IO point of view, I don't quite understand why this is a source of friction, because cost itself is not necessarily a market friction if it's an integral part of the bank's production technology, if you think of a bank as a supplier. So I hope there is more clarification on why this is a source of friction. My personal takeaway is that it is a source of friction as a remedy for the information friction, which is often studied in corporate loan market. And that is also how the previous paper by Greenwood and his co-authors interpret this intermediation cost. So with the information friction, it is very costly for banks to observe asset and productivity. And by paying this cost, it reveals perfect information. And then this assumption also makes sense. So I think it will be reasonable to interpret it this way. And it has been done in previous literature, so I don't think it will look weird or anything. My second main comment is about these 2 types of borrowing. In the model, the entrepreneur can borrow either in a state of normal or in a state of extra borrowing. They differ in terms of loan size, intermediation cost, and such interest rate. And the switch between the 2 states are exogenous. And I understand the assumption is driven by to better mapping the data, because in the data you see revolving lines of credit versus investment loans. I guess there could be add more nuances to this assumption to better fit the empirical features around this. For example, allowing the probability of extra borrowing to change with asset and, it's A or Z, to change with asset and or productivity. Because empirically, the use of revolving lines of credit decreases with loan size. And also, maybe, this is maybe a little harder to do, but typically revolving loans of credit are unsecured, and investment loans are typically secured. So maybe they imply different kind of collateral constraints. And lastly, maybe a little more explanation on why intermediation costs should differ by loan type. And then I'll skip this comment because it's about calibration, and this is not really covered in the presentation. Some minor comments is that first, I'd like to take one step further and think about policy implications. What can we take away? Does this suggest that policy directly targeting the spread can have large impacts? For example, interest rate caps or subsidies for the bank. on the intermediation cost. It will be interesting to evaluate these policies using a counterfactual because you already have the model. That is, your model can trade off this benefits for firms versus the cost of the subsidy. And then the second comment is on earmarked loans, maybe excluding the calibration because it's very special. And your model mostly is more about free market credit. And finally, just to conclude, I think this paper has important questions, high quality empirical analysis, and very nice results. Maybe it can further improve by adding more interpretation of the intermediation cost, calibration of model, and then talk more about the policy implications. Very exciting paper. I think it definitely deserves a spot on the top journal, and I look forward to its publication. Thank you.
Thiago, would you like to comment or make any reference to that?
I just want to thank Phoebe. Was very nice because she summarized it very well, the paper, after, kind of I rush a little bit. So, yeah, we can discuss a little bit more some of the points, and I think she's right in most of them. So I'm happy to discuss later on those, unless, kind of there are other questions related to that.
Thank you. Now I open the floor to the audience to any questions or comments to either to our presenter, our panelist, Thiago, or Phoebe for her comments. I don't see any hands up. So, okay, let's move to our next panelist. So, congratulations and thank you, Phoebe, for your comments and suggestions. So, I'd like to invite you, Phoebe Tian, to present the paper on mortgage put-back risk and lender market power in refinancing.
First of all, thanks the organizer to include this paper in this conference. I really enjoyed the conference and all the interactions so far. This project is, the title doesn't really reflect what we want to do. It's mostly about, it's an example of how the implementation of government policy can exacerbate market power and lead to frictions. So let me begin by noting that government policies often relies on financial intermediaries to implement. For example, around the world, there are loan subsidy programs for certain types of groups. For example, in Brazil, there's earmarked loans for specific sectors that belongs to that kind of intervention. However, the implementation of such policy are often asymmetric across financial intermediations because financial intermediaries are differentiated. Sometimes certain intermediaries may have advantages over others when implementing the policy. And then if the implication of that is such advantages may exacerbate their existing market power and lead to competitive frictions. And with enhanced market power, these intermediaries might extract the rent instead of fully pass through the program benefits to the targeted groups. Okay? So that's a general idea, and this paper really aims to quantify the consequence of such asymmetry. And we do that in a very specific context of the post-2008 stimulus program in the United States. And we focus not only on financial consumers, but also on broader stakeholders. So now let me dive into a little more background on this program. So after the great financial crisis of 2008, many mortgage borrowers' home equity were wiped out, which means that their home value had a sharp decline. That means their loan-to-value ratio, which is the outstanding loan balance divided by their current home value, will shoot up. okay? So what's the implication of that? Well, in US, most of the mortgages are fixed rate, okay? Their mortgage rate can only be changed if they go to a lender and refinance their mortgages, okay? And the thing is, traditionally, there is an LTV restriction on refinance. It cannot be higher than 80%. So after the great financial crisis, with many borrowers' LTV going up, many of them cannot refinance their fixed-rate mortgages because of that traditional constraint. And they're losing out on a lot of potential payment because after the financial crisis, rate has been cut, okay? And it is in this backdrop that the government, the US government, launched this Home Affordable Refinance Program, which I will refer to as HARP. This program allows those borrowers, to refinance again. And the goal is to lower their mortgage payment so that they have more money to consume and stimulate the economy. Okay, that all makes sense. And then the way this program is implemented is, again, through mortgage lenders. So as a borrower, if I want to access this program, I go to a mortgage lender and do a refinance under this program. And the lender can do that because then the underwriting standards were lowered for them under this program. However, lenders under this program are faced with asymmetric expected costs. And more specifically, the current lender of a mortgage, which I will refer to as the incumbent, they are faced with less putback risk. Putback risk is essentially a residual credit risk, which I will talk more about, which I will talk more here. So bear with me with a little more details. So in states, most of the mortgages are purchased and guaranteed by Fannie and Freddie, which is collectively known as the government-sponsored enterprises, and I will refer to them as GSEs. These guarantees from GSEs protect mortgage lenders against credit risk, because if the loan default, GSEs will bear the costs instead of the lenders. But it also creates potential agency conflicts between the GSEs and the lender, because the lender will be like, oh, I'm not the one who is on hook, so why should I do a good job of verifying income, for example? Now, as a way to ameliorate this problem, GSEs return the right to put back the mortgage by forcing the lender to buy it back. And that basically transfers the credit risk back to the lender. So that's why you can think of pullback risk as a residual credit risk. It typically happens for loans that already show signs of delinquency, that GSEs think it's because the original lender didn't do a good job of underwriting it. This putback is really costly for lenders, because that typically will imply a credit loss on their book. But this is really not a concern before 2008, because it rarely happened before 2008. But after the great financial crisis, GSEs start aggressively review and audit loans and put back a large chunk of them. And from the lender's perspective, this putback risk now rises to unprecedented levels. And it is especially true for loans with very high LTV ratios, specifically those with LTV larger than 80%. Here is a graph. So this is showing the putback probability rise sharply after the great financial crisis, and this is to show that the most of the putback loans are those with LTV larger than 80%. So not only the risk is higher after the great financial crisis, lenders' exposure to this risk is asymmetric. for high LTV refinances under HARP. And that is an unintended consequences of the pullback policy back then, because the pullback policy was quite ambiguous about how to deal with these refinances. So that left a lot of room for discretion, okay? And somehow GSE just treat the same lender refinances as more appropriately underwritten, safer. So they are less likely to be put back, okay? And why does that matter? Because in the mortgage refinancing market, previous literature has already identified search friction as an important source of market power for incumbent lenders. So they are already in an advantageous position. Now they are faced with lower pullback risk, and that's translating to lower expected cost for them. That augmented their market power. So instead of passing down lower costs, they will just extract rent. That is best put by a quote from the testimony from an industry expert in 2011. She said, the most fundamental problem of HARP is that if the same servicer or the lender is the only one who can refinance the borrower, there is no incentive for that servicer to offer a competitive rate, okay? And after this testimony, this problem became quite publicized. And in 2013, the government responded by changing the policy around putback. And under the new framework, this asymmetry was mostly corrected. And not only that, the overall putback risk was reduced dramatically. However, I would argue this happened too late because by then, most of the HARP refinancing has already taken place. So in this paper, we want to look at the welfare implications of the pre-2013 implementation of the putback policy, focusing on the asymmetry of the risk and how it have competitive effects. To that end, we develop a structural model of dynamic refinancing decisions where the interest rate on the refinances come from a negotiating process between the borrower and differentiated lenders, among which the incumbent has special advantage from two sources, the search friction and also a cost advantage because they face lower putback risk, okay? And then we take the model to the data by estimating it using loan level data by a maximum likelihood. The identification utilized this sharp policy change in 2013. So in case I don't have time, here's a takeaway from our finding. First, this asymmetric putback risk has significant welfare consequence for borrowers. And importantly, the asymmetry of the risk is as important as the risk itself, okay? So the symmetry is not just a second order thought. It is as important as the risk itself. And second, its impact is higher than the impact from search friction, which is a well-documented source of friction in the refinancing market. And lastly, this asymmetric pullback risk also hurts the GSEs, who are the taxpayers, and also the investors in mortgage-backed securities, because they are the ultimate source of funding in this market. Okay, and the reason they got involved because their profits indirectly hinge on borrowers' behavior, which change endogenously. Okay, and then in terms of contribution to the literature, I have to say we are not the first one to document this competitive friction from HARP, but our main contribution is in terms of quantification and also give a fuller picture of not only what happened to the borrowers, but also GSEs and investors. Okay, so here's our reduced form analysis to sort of motivate the full model. We use the data from HARP refinances for this part. The this data allows us to identify if a refinance is with the incumbent lender or not the incumbent lender. And then we look at the effect of the 2013 policy change. We first look at the outcome of putback. So here in this table, the dependent variable is whether the loan is eventually put back or not. And we included a lot of controls with fixed effects, but the main variables we're interested in is first the difference between incumbents and other lenders in the pre-change period, and second, the effect of the policy change on all lenders, and also the difference between the incumbent lender and other lenders after the policy change. So we can see that before the policy change, the incumbent has a significantly lower probability of being put back. And the policy change decreased the probability of putback for both incumbents and competing lenders. And after the policy change, the incumbent no longer has a significantly different putback probability. So that asymmetry is corrected. And we can also look at what happens to the interest rate on HARP refinances. So same regression, just change the dependent variable. We can see that prior to the policy change, the incumbent actually extract a higher interest rate. So that echoes the reason we talked about earlier, is that although they have a lower risk and thus cost, they do not pass it down because they have augmented market power. So they extract rent instead. And after the policy change, the interest rate on all refinances drop. And then after the change, the difference between incumbent and competing lender is almost the same. Like the number is very economic and small. And also, if we look at the switching rate, which is the fraction of borrowers who switch to a different lender, it increases from 16% to 27% after the policy change, which indicates a reduction of the market power of the incumbent after the policy change. I'm definitely not going to go into details of the model, but this model just try to specify the borrower's dynamic refinancing decisions, and by letting them to choose between whether to refinance or wait in each period. And if they refinance, they first contact their incumbent lender to get an offer. And then they look at the offer, they look at their realization of search cost, and then they can decide whether they want to not search and stay with and refinance with the incumbent, or they reject the incumbent's initial offer and go to the market, gather all the competing lenders, and let them fight for each other and give a competitive rate. Okay, so that's the structure of the model. I'm going to skip all the details and just show you some interesting results. So the results all come from this counterfactual analysis, where this is the first is the baseline, where before 2013 you have a very high and asymmetric putback risk, and then the first counterfactual we run is we remove that asymmetry prior to 2013. We only remove the asymmetry, leaving the level not changed. And then the last column is we remove both asymmetry and also reduce the level of risk to the post-2013 level. Okay? And what we find is that very modest effect on refinancing rate or default rate, but most of the effect is come from the total payments that a borrower has to pay in their whole lifetime. Okay, and that reduction is even higher for HARP borrowers, and that's the main driver of the borrower welfare, of changes in borrower welfare. And this is due to two things. First, they have a lower interest rate, and second, they refinance earlier. The benefit of refinance earlier is then you have a shorter total amortization period, so that reduces your total borrowing costs. And then we look at what the impact on GSEs and investors. we see a slight increase in GSE profits, mostly because now more people refinances. So although putback risk directly will incur more loss to GSE profits, but that's sort of canceled out with the benefits they get from higher refinancing volume. So overall, it's a net positive for GSEs. And it's also a net positive for investors because now borrowers refinance earlier. And in that environment, rate has been declining. So if they refinance earlier, that means the investor can be locked in a better rate. Okay. So to conclude, we found that putback risk created significant market distortions after great financial crisis, and most of that is because the risk exposures is unequal. Okay, and the policy implication from our funding is that first, implementation of government policies should really consider the competitive effect, how it interacts with pre-existing competitive frictions. That is very important. That can be very important. It is not necessarily of second-order effect. And it is also important for current context in the US mortgage market, because now after COVID, this sort of, the history is sort of happening again. They are also considering revisions to putback policies, but that revision, again, it does not apply equally to all lenders. So the same thing could happen again. That's all for my presentation. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Phoebe. I'd like to invite Yanis for his comments and questions.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for having me here. I've never written a structural model since my PhD, so that was a high bar. So everything I say today is take with a pinch of salt. So let us kind of summarize a little bit what the paper is about. So the paper examines the link between mortgage putback risk and lender market power in the US refinancing market. The question that they're really after, they're thinking, what happens if I change this putback risk, and how does it affect the equilibrium outcomes in the credit market, right? How does it affect prices and quantities in some sense? And the methodology is, first they document empirical patterns that are consistent with putback risk, exploiting some policy shifts. And then the big part of the paper is obviously the structural model that they then try to match the data with. And the key finding is that the higher putback risk exposure is associated with greater lender market power and less favorable terms for borrowers. A little bit kind of to recap what mortgage putback risk, right? It's the risk that the originator must take back or buy back the loan from the security holder if something comes up, right? That there's some inconsistency with the initial information that the originator provided. So think about misrepresentation of borrower's creditworthiness will be obviously something very important, or the collateral value. And this is context is specifically mortgages in the US, and the impact of the mortgage putback risk is that it basically shifts the credit risk back to the originator. So you're always wondering what happens if somebody gives me back the things. So the contribution, how I see it, right, it's kind of thinking about how this putback risk translates into market power. So complementing some well-known facts already of kind of search costs or inattention. So that's where the paper wants to position itself. So I don't really have any substantial comments on the theory, because I don't know all the specific details when you model these things and how they will affect your decisions. So I will have more like questions to someone as me who is less kind of expert in this field. When I read this, what did I think about when I had it? So that's kind of how I will look at it. So my first fundamental concept, because the paper motivates this putback risk by the empirical kind of analysis of the policy shift in the US. And for me, as I applied micro, I immediately was thinking, okay, is this risk, or is this some kind of changes in realization? Is it salience, because now government talks about it, and oh yeah, remember that thing was important? Or is it just attention? It brings it to attention of the people, right? And all those things, they're very related, and that I'm pretty sure they have a lot of common predictions, and it's kind of quite important to understand a little bit better how exactly this policy maybe works. Right? From me, when I look at a paper, I see it as a lemons problem, so the incumbent knows more than the new lender, and that's kind of how I see this problem. How do you ensure that this information asymmetry is reduced? And is that putback risk? I don't know. I mean, to me, that's the putback risk is, you know, if I don't know, obviously there might be lemons problem at the end of the day. So, I see it as a lemons problem in here. As an information. So this is kind of just kind of how to motivate or phrase and link it with theory and empirics, because the empirics is really tricky. So then in theory, I was just thinking, right, is this putback risk increasing some operational or expected cost that the lenders face, and therefore they charge higher markups? Is it some uncertainty about future liabilities, some risk aversion kicks in, therefore they want to be compensated for that? Or is it some kind of differential costs across lenders, that these new lenders have higher costs or lower technology, and these compliance costs are really high, and that also could generate some of these things. So again, I'm kind of nailing down these. I think that specifically what's in this institutional setting and how that's in the model, it wasn't clear, at least in the text. So from theory, I was just wondering, right, generally we think, or at least there are a lot of papers that talk about, you know, people are not really fully aware of everything that goes around them. Like specifically here, it seems they know fully what is refinancing cost for each individual. People generally don't even shop for mortgages. They have one mortgage, so thinking that they understand what is the refinancing costs and how these things change across time, I don't know, is it important or is it not? I have no idea. And also risk neutrality, is that again important or no? Because that doesn't sound like how people operate in reality. And how does it interact with these established factors? I think that's kind of something that you touched upon in the presentation, which is search costs on inattention, right? These surviving with, in combination with those channels, or does it become worse or better? So then about empirics, I really would want to see a lot more. I mean, maybe it's the writing part, which was just, I needed more details on how the reform worked to understand exactly what's changing, what's not. So that really will help to understand, is it a putback risk or something else that's occurring? Is it a standard deviation? Is it the expected level? Like what's changing here? And also, what does the incumbent lender mean, right? What are we proxying? When we proxy for risk through something called incumbent lender, you know, I don't know what that means. That could mean probably many, many, many things. And it's like for me as an empiricist, this probably is the biggest kind of, you know, stylized fact, because the paper tries to push it quite far, this reform thing. But I mean, if you think about what happens with these refinancing reforms, and you compare something before and something after, it's very tricky, right? Composition changes, selection changes, who goes for the market, who gets approved, the prices, the quantity. So it's kind of hard to, in some sense, is it risk changing, or is it just people who refinance change? And by design, these are the loans that are going to be higher longer in their life cycle, right? This T to maturity is by design. So they look at loans that are issued in 2006. So they will be different by design, so they cannot be the same. So it's kind of hard to disentangle what is changing besides the reform there as well. So to conclude, so I think this paper really is coming next to these papers that talk about search costs, some capacity constraints, or inattention, where they want to put a new mechanism that could also explain these patterns, but in a different kind of different way. And obviously, from policy point of view, this would be very important. So if you could really nail it, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanis. Phoebe would like to comment or respond on that.
Yes, thanks, Janice, for your suggestions. I think you had a very nice explanation of putback risk that I do. And yeah, I really like the point you raised, and I think those are the areas that we should improve our writing for sure. And about information asymmetry, we actually did a test on the ex-post default rate between the incumbent and the other lenders to just look at, do they actually have different information set, and we didn't find differences. So that's why we didn't use information symmetry to motivate their differences. Yeah, but other suggestions are well taken, and we can discuss more later. Yeah.
Thank you. Now I open the floor to the audience for comments or questions to our panelists and debater. I don't see any hands up. Okay, so thank you. Let's move to our next panel. So I invite Yanis to present the paper on housing and fertility.
It's exciting to see how everyone is excited to end. Very committed, good students. So thank you so much for having me here. This is an empirical paper where we are trying to link housing and fertility. We're really thinking about what affects fertility in the setting, and the kind of thing that we will examine is going to be housing. So it's going to be an empirical paper where the key cool thing is we will be able to randomize housing. So this is a joint work with my old friend and really long-time co-author that has now come into a long kind of research agenda with Bernardus van Doornik from Central Bank of Brazil, who is not actually today in the audience because he just kind of didn't feel well. But I want to thank guys from Central Bank, Mikio, and people who really help us develop a lot of very interesting research. So this is kind of one of the things we already write with him, so which is pretty amazing. Okay, so to motivate the paper, if you look in 1960, the countries where the fertility rate was below the replacement rate, which is 2.1 children per woman, constituted something like 4.3% of the world's population. So that would be like Sweden, Latvia, this is where I'm actually from, and some other small countries. So it's really, really kind of small fraction of the world actually was below the replacement rate. If you look at these numbers, in 2021, now 76% of world's population is below the replacement rate. So really the fertility rate has dropped dramatically, and this has become like a really important policy kind of consideration almost everywhere in the kind of developing and developed world. So if you open many kind of major news articles, every other week you will have a major kind of column or an article that talks about, okay, it's falling. There's so many policies we do, like in Korea is obviously, so if you go here, Korea has 0.7 children per woman, actually 0.64, which is incredibly small. And there have been extremely generous programs in Korea. They even, I think, give $14,000 to incentivize marriage and stuff like that. And nothing really seems to work. So there's a lot of discussion, okay, you know, what can we do to actually encourage or improve fertility rates? Because if you think from economics point of view, that has massive long-term implications. Healthcare, pensions, voting, consumption, everything, right? It's going to have important implications for the longer run. So kind of really what this paper is thinking about in here is what are the important factors that affect the fertility of households, right? What are the decisions, the factors that will really influence the decision of a household to have or not to have children. And this is why I like this paper the most, is because these are my two kids. So I can actually put my own children in an academic presentation. So what is the paper about? So right, we ask, does housing and housing credit, and I will be very specific why housing credit is important in this setting, affect the probability and the number of children that a household chooses to have? And the cool thing is going to be, we are going to use a randomized allocation of housing credit. So this is a Brazilian audience, it's going to be consortios. And we are going to use a lottery that's embedded in the consortia to allocate the housing credit to individuals across Brazil. So what do we find? The first thing is access to housing does impact fertility, and substantially. So if you are a 20 to 25-year-old who wants to get a housing and you randomly get it, your fertility is going to increase by about 1/3. What's also important, there is no effect for people above 40, which is consistent with the medical literature, that risks go up and most people are done with their fertility choices after this age. But the most important, really the most important punchline of this paper is this sentence, right? What is the completed lifetime fertility, right? It's not, because we want to really know, is it people delaying or moving choices of children across time? But completed fertility thinks about, okay, now you are 40 or older, what's the overall lifetime fertility that you have? And the finding that we have, so imagine if again you're a 20-year-old person and you get a housing now versus you have to wait until 30, your lifetime fertility is going to be twice higher. So these 10 years will cost half of your overall completed fertility. And that's really, really, really stark and strong finding that we find in this paper. So we do find that people get their house, they move to better areas, so it's upwards mobility. And the contribution is really making this causal link, because people have, I mean, it's very common to think about housing as being one of the most important things for households, and that's kind of the family nest. But it's very tricky to do this causally, right? To understand how it affects fertility causally, and this is really the contribution of this paper. So before I get on the kind of data and whatnot, I want to just give a little bit of survey evidence to provide context and how we should think about the people who participate in these programs. So this is a survey run by Association of Consortios in Brazil, where they basically asked two questions. One question was, why are you buying real estate? And what happens is that 1/3 of the participants in a consortium, they buy for family formation. And it's roughly 2/3 of them will say, I want to have children, and 1/3 of them will be, I want to marry. So we cannot treat them as similar, because most of the times one leads to the other. Now the second question, so one is people buy houses to get families. Second question is, where do they live before? Because these are not homeless people, right? They have some housing. So what happens is that 40% of the population lives with their parents. So they really want to get in their own housing. So this is kind of something very, very important, kind of housing stock improvement for these people. Some of them rent or own, but really the majority is living with the parents. Now, I want to talk a little bit about consortia. So this audience should know a lot about them, but I will kind of give a little bit of overview. So we call them savings and credit contracts, because what consortia effectively does, initially you save, and then at some point you will get a credit, and you turn into a credit contract. So we examined those in another paper of ours theoretically, but what's important, these contracts are extremely common in developing countries. So this is a very standard contract. What's different in Brazil, it's supercharged. It's kind of so much powerful because you use fiduciary lien on these collaterals, and it works really, really well here. Okay, what it is, it's a group lending mechanism to acquire durable goods. You can we have papers about motorcycles, but this one will be about houses. And it's typically organized by a bank or a specialized consortia administrator. So it could be, I think Itaú also has, Caixa has, and there are many other specialized administrators that do only housing. Key features, everyone, right, you sign up for I think it's like 12, 15 years on average, the contract duration, where you'll make identical monthly payments. So it's just 15 years, every month you're going to make a payment, and you do this for the whole 15 years. Since this is a closed-end group, so money is flowing in. Whenever there's enough money, somebody from the group gets to borrow from the group. So it's kind of a closed-end group, like a bank, or think about in old days in the US, that was builders and loans associations. Now what's cool is that how does the allocation of funds happen? It's either through a lottery or an auction. So what I was, we talk in the paper about auctions, but I really focus only on the lotteries here, because that's going to be the part which we can identify for a random variation. Everyone has to pay until after they win the good as well, because then that becomes a credit contract. So all the 15 years you have to pay, but also when you win. And ultimately everyone will get the good unless you default. So if you don't default, you will be the last person to save for the good in the worst case scenario. Okay, about the lottery. So this is going to be really at the core what we use in our paper. So this is incredibly genius in some ways, right? They have algorithms in their contract. So you sign up for a contract, they have an algorithm, a mathematical algorithm that takes Loteria Federal, right, which is a government lottery, completely transparent, completely unmanipulatable, and obviously completely orthogonal to whatever happens in consortia. So what they do is they have a mathematical algorithm that takes the most recent lottery numbers and will predict who is the winner of the allocation, which is completely random in this setting. So how does it work? So there are many algorithms, but I'll just give you one to understand how it works. So imagine I have 25 participants in a group. What's going to happen? Everyone gets 4 digits from 0 to 90, 4 unique digits. So everyone has 4 digits between 0 and 99. Now imagine the most recent Loteria Federal numbers were these 5 numbers, and what the typical algorithm will say, take the last 2 digits of the first number, which is 57, that's the winner number 1 in this round. So that's the predicted winner number 1. Then you go to the third and fourth, which is 45, then second and third, which is 34, then 83, then you go to the next number, and you create this sequence of winners. Why is the sequence important? So imagine later in the group, 57 has already won in the previous round, so that person is not participating anymore, so the second in the queue has the right to win. If everyone is already drawn from these 20, they have a mathematical rule, go back to 57, plus 1, minus 1, plus 1, minus 1, until you hit someone who is participating. So what's great is that this by design is going to be relevant. It's going to predict who is going to win the group, but it's orthogonal to the characteristics of an individual. So it's not going to correlate with your desire to have children or timing issues and whatnot. So the empirical design, think about this, is going to be in a simple way, difference and difference. We will compare people within the same group because we want to control for the selection. Some people might like this or another group. I don't know why. So what we do for that is simply compare people within the same group. So by design, that's controlled for. So we'll never compare across groups. And then we'll exploit simply this random algorithm that predicts the winning of the consortium. So because we have auctions, we have to do an IV. Maybe Thiago will talk more about that, I don't know. But we do an IV just to predict. So think about there's an outcome of lottery winner, but we will use the simulated lottery winner to predict the actual lottery winner, which deals with the problem there's some auctions. So there's going to be 2-stage least squares when I do everything in this. So the variation is going to come still from the same lottery that I start. And it's obviously a very strong instrument. Okay, data is obviously amazing. I've been working in Brazil so long now that it doesn't need to be sold anymore, especially for this audience. So the one thing I want to talk about is a bit of characteristics. So consortios are so they're much less formally employed. And one reason is that in Brazil, to get a mortgage from a bank, you need to have formal income. So consortia is actually, you could think even it's more representative for an average person in Brazil. Their average age is 40, so they're in a bit in the older age. They appoint roughly 2/3 men, and 24% of them have children, and 0.44 children. So mortgages, you can see the income is a little bit lower, but it's highly formally employed people. That's really the important part. So this is Minha Casa Minha Vida, and Minha Casa Minha Vida obviously has very low income people. So that's a very different sample of population. So this can really more like the average upper level Brazilian. Okay, fertility outcome. So this is the dynamic estimation of what happens around the time when you randomly win the housing. So -1 is just before you get drawn in the lottery, and 0 is the year when you actually get drawn in the lottery. So this is just to see the dynamic effects, right? There's no pre-treatment trend and stuff like that, as you would expect when it's a random lottery. So the probability increases over time. I think the more interesting graph is this one, when we now think a little bit more about the life cycle of people. Because remember, my average person in the sample is 40, so it means for half of the population, this is not going to be really the most important effect. So that's why the average treatment effect is not really that interesting. So here it really makes sense to look at age distribution. So what we do is we split below 20, 20, 25, 25, 30, 30, 35, 35, 40, and 40 and above. So what's happening is that the strongest treatment effect is in the childbearing age, especially the younger population, where you actually expect this to be really important. They're also likely to be more credit constrained, and also this fertility decisions are really important at that point in time. So the treatment effect kind of declines over time. Now again, so that was right. You can always think people delay, and then long term you would not have the same. You would still have the same number of children. What's great with this setting, we actually can estimate whether people have the same number of children when their fertile age is kind of over for most part. So what we kind of ask here is, right, think about winning early versus late, right? Because the timing is going to be random. So the thought experiment that you have to have in mind, I imagine I'm 20, I want to get a child, but because of random misluck, let's unluck, I get it only at age 30. And I can see what is your total number of children when you're 40 or older. And the difference in the 10 years is going to be random between the two of you. So that's going to be the experiment. We are going to look at people who joined before 40 and look at them at the very last period in our sample when you are 40 or older. And then you can compare what's the total number of children that you have relative to someone who got it earlier. So I will summarize this in one picture. So this is for 20 to 24-year-olds. Again, two-stage least squares where we instrument the weighting with the national lottery. So the result is really strong. So imagine if you are a person at 20 who gets it immediately, that's the 0 point, or you have to wait for 10 years, which is the 9 point. Your number of children is going to be half times lower than it would have been if you had it gotten immediately. So from a policy point of view, this is probably the most important point because it really talks about what does it mean in a longer term in terms of, really your fertility choices. Now, the question is, what do people do and how do they achieve? So we can say some things. We obviously cannot nail all the mechanisms that could explain this thing, but at least we will try to get closer to it. So the first question is, do people move? So what's the challenge with our analysis here is we only have zip code information. There is no addresses, so we don't know more. If you move within the same city, which has one zip code, then we don't even observe that. So this is going to be cross zip code movements, and we do observe that people move across zip codes over time. And this is especially important for the younger individuals. So the younger individuals really tend to move out somewhere. So where do they move? Again, we can summarize these other outcome variables. It's kind of upwards mobility. So these are going to be areas with lower crime rates. These are going to be areas which are wealthier, so higher income per capita. And probably the most important is that these are areas with high home ownership rates. So it's an area where it's hard to rent. So if you want a desired housing level, you can only buy in those areas. So it's kind of consistent with those. That's why you really need to have the ownership here. Now, we also had a model, which is not really that important for the paper, but there's some interesting and theoretical predictions that we test here. And I think the one most important, which I really only want to talk about, is income effect. So think about rental savings. So what happens in this scenario is when I win a lottery, I can move in my house and I can move out, let's say, from my rental apartment. Remember that 47% lived with parents, so rent wasn't even that important there. But one idea what you could have is that I can simply afford because I have more income now, that I don't need to pay for rent. So what we do here to get more at this question is, again, Brazil's amazing data sets, is Brazilian payment system. So what we do is we look at the payment systems on, we filter payments that have word alug, rent. We look at boletos that are paid to the real estate companies for rent, and we can classify who is really a renter and also observe what is the amount of rent they pay. So it really would be an income effect. This is the group of people that should really see a big effect because I save money. What is happening is that this is really not going on. There's no really differential treatment effect. I mean, theoretically, you can also see their opposing forces because if you have more income, the cost of raising child, opportunity cost also increases, so they kind of start canceling each other out. But it was still important, I think the most important alternative channel besides the housing itself. And again, remember, 47% of people didn't even pay rent because they were living with their parents. Okay, and there are other predictions in the model that we had. So one, we find that this quality, if you lived in an area that had really bad housing, that's where the treatment effect is larger. Again, kind of thinking about housing frictions. And then there's income dynamics. So the model is always, the classic Beckert model will say if you have higher income, your opportunity cost of raising a child goes up, fertility goes down. And you do find here as well that for higher income households, the effect is going to be much, much smaller. And also, consistent with this, if you assume that women bear more of the child raising cost, if they bring a lot of income in the household, also the treatment is going to be lower because it's costlier for the family to afford a child because of this income effect. Now the conclusion is, right, we are able to show that housing and housing credit really has a very big impact on increasing fertility, which is a major problem across the world. And these effects are really large. If you are 20 to 25-year-old, it's going to be 1/3 higher fertility. No effect above 40. And again, the most important conclusion is that at the age of kind of when your fertility is over, and if you are 20, whether you get it at 30, your number of children will be twice lower because of those 10 years of waiting. So individuals move to better areas, and the contribution is really to link these credit constraints and housing constraints with fertility choices. So let me leave with this, and I think this really summarizes the paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yanis. Now invite Thiago for comments and questions.
Thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this paper, because I really I think it's a very important question. I have written some work on fertility on the other way, trying to explain or trying to control fertility. And it's interesting that the problem is the reverse now, right? So I think my comments are going to be very general and a little bit about, kind of the pitch of the paper, rather than going like in the implementability of what they have done, because I really like what they have done. I think it was very clever, and I think the results are very interesting. Okay, so I'm not going to add much on, kind of the empirical strategy or anything like that, right? So the question is very important question: does access to housing, which per se is already an important question, does this access cause any change in fertility, and also in the time of the fertility? Okay, so that's really kind of the question. And the first paper about fertility in economics is this paper by Gary Becker. It's a beautiful paper. There is almost no equation. It's only about kind of a philosophical way about thinking about fertility, and it's really a beautiful paper. And that's really where Becker, introduced the concept of quantity equality. And the idea is that, children are kind of a durable goods. And then with durable goods, as your income increase, you want to have more children, but you also want to increase the quality of your goods. And that's basically the idea that Gary Becker has, kind of on the paper, right? And as income rise, you can think about, the quality elasticity is higher than the quantity elasticity, meaning that you want to invest more in the quality, and that translates in more investment in education. And so that's basically, kind of the view that Gary Becker introduced, kind of in this beautiful paper on fertility. And I was saying there is another beautiful book, actually, by Malthus, and is also super philosophical, on the essays of the principle of population, right? And then there is this quote by Malthus, which I think it's very interesting, is the passion between the sexes is necessary and will remain nearly in its present state. And that's going to translate always in higher fertility, okay? But we know that, kind of there are ways to control this desire, or at least not the desire, but, kind of the results of the desire. Right. And, if you think about in the 1960s and 1970s, I was saying that we are worried about the very high fertility. And then there is this famous book, the population book, okay? And that, kind of, it says in brief, death controls goes with the grain, meaning that it's easy, to think about policy about death controls, but birth controls is really kind of hard policy to introduce. And I think we overcome some of these issues, right? So we've been, kind of these things I think we overcome. But there is another one in the 1970s. So it's a prediction, right? So the book was, published in the 1968, but already in the 1970s, it's a prediction of the book, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death. Okay? So it's really kind of, starking, kind of prediction about the rise in fertility that goes back to Malthus. Okay. And as Jan was showing, there is the fertility rates are historical low. Korea, you said, was 0.69. That means, you need one generation to have a population that would be 30% lower in levels, okay? And 2 generations to be basically half of the population, okay? Massive effect on, kind of and many things, labor market, social security, and economic growth, right? So most of the papers on, kind of endogenous economic growth, that is, kind of the drive of ideas is really kind of a market size. And the market size is going to be, meaning population is going to fall, and then the market size is going to shrink, and maybe ideas are going to be harder to be found. Okay. So, and basically, kind of housing is really frequently cited as a major barrier, right, for having, kind of housing space. If you have children, you need housing space, you need car space, you need, vacation, you need a bunch of things. That's going to translate constraint for fertility, right? And that's basically, kind of housing is also one of the main assets of the family, and it's really kind of what they explore, which I think is super important. And there is a music, right, a song in Brazil that translates the paper, I think, right? So, quem ama quer casa, quem quer casa quer criança, right? So that meaning, those who love, they want a house, and those who want a house, they want a child, right? And so on, right? And causality is very hard to address, and that's really kind of the, the beauty of the paper. They use, kind of this lottery that is explained very well, how they did. The IV is also very clever. They simulate a lottery divided by the number of participants, and then with the number, they multiply the remainder, by the number of the participants, and then they use the same algorithm to kind of translate to see who is going to win, if there was, because of the auctions, who could win the lottery with some probability, right? So they show that it's a valid instrument, and it's still really kind of exogenous because you basically use the same kind of algorithm that the lottery uses. Okay? So very large effects, right, on fertility, and very important also not only for when you receive the house, but also in completed fertility, because you could think about this only an effect, in the time of fertility. But they show also that, there is an effect on completed fertility. Right? So they have a basic model to introduce, which is the quantity-quality trade-off that Becker introduced, right? And there is an implication of the model, which is basically how they try to explain. It's really kind of a change in the price or the cost of the house, right? So they think about the housing or the cost of that you spend, because once you are in the lottery, you are paying, your rent, but you're also paying the consortiums, right? So then basically, when you win, and then you can move out to the house and you decrease, right? So, it can be that, but as you show, many people actually live with their parents. It can actually be the case that the cost is actually increased rather than decreased, right? So, I mean, I know that's not key of the paper, and then another thing is that this translates also in a fall in investment in education per child, using the Gary Becker, kind of the idea, right? So is really that the case, or is really only an income effect that you observe? Is really kind of a price effect that you're observing, or is really just an income effect? Because if it's only an income effect, then fertility is going to increase, and also education is going to increase, right? So the mechanism, that the interpretation, I know that's a very small part of the paper, but kind of that's what I think is it's important to have an idea of the framework that you have in mind, and I think it would be interesting to think a little bit more about that. Okay, so that's kind of one point. Okay? So I think it's the threats of identification is really well done with the paper, with different strategies. So I'm not going to go over again, kind of on the idea. So let me briefly, kind of give the general comments. So paper is excellent, it's very good. I really like it to read. I really, enjoy reading. And I learned, kind of your research that I haven't, I knew about you before, but I haven't read any of your papers. So it was nice to read. The paper is really motivated by very low fertility. But in some way, the paper doesn't really show that the fertility in the aggregate is going to increase. In the aggregate, actually can decrease if you have more credit, because this can increase house price, right? So in some way, kind of, from a macro development person, I would be, thinking about the question and I'd say, is not super clear. Of course, if you increase, say, the supply of housing, that's going to generate the effect that you want. Okay, so just to be careful about that. And of course, kind of in our kind of tried, empirical work that we have, that is also the external validity, because most of the families or the people the individuals that participate in the lottery, they wanted to have children already, right? So giving access to other, kind of individuals, right, is not necessarily going to increase fertility, as we observe, for instance, in China, they reduce, they relax the one-child policy, and basically nothing changed in terms of, because social norms are so, kind of one child, the vacation, the car, the house, everything. So it's very hard. So I'm going to, I think, yeah. So.
Thank you. Yanis, would you like to comment or to respond?
Thank you. I mean, I agree with everything. I think it would be great to write structural model, think about Docker, because those are trade-offs that we don't talk about. I only want to make a little bit of the external validity. It's completely true. We are very transparent about that in paper, but we look at it actually as a bonus, not a minus. Because in a way, if you're a policymaker, there are two questions. One is, what happens if I relax a constraint? Who is somebody who is subject to that constraint? That's question number one. Question number two, how do I target the person who is subject to that constraint? So what this paper does is about what happens if I relax this constraint to someone who has that constraint. But yeah, wouldn't be the same for others, but that's a different question. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I open the floor for our audience for comments and questions.
A question, my curiosity, what data set do you use to find if the people have or not have children?
What data set?
What data set do you use to find who get children or not?
Receita Federal. Census População.
Yes, please.
Yanis, hi, here, the other side.
Oh.
Hello, very nice, super nice paper. I was thinking in terms of like general equilibrium dynamics, have you thought about any potential spillovers of the treatment on the controls? I'm thinking, for example, on effects that you may consider on the rental market. So as these families that win the lottery exit the rental market to own a house, you may have some changes in supply and demand, basically lower demand, lower prices in the rental market, maybe changing through some mechanism their own family or fertility decisions of the control, so to say, of the non-selected ones. Another dynamic could operate through the labor market. I'm not sure how that could operate, but think about the selected families that move to home ownership, decide to lower eventually their participation in the labor market. Maybe the women, for example, decides to exit to take care of the child. Maybe creating, if that happens in a sizable scale, you may expect to have some shifts in local labor supply. Have you considered any dynamic of this sort? Thank you.
It's on. I didn't know I'm on. So yeah, I mean, we've spent a lot of time thinking about it, but we have a very simple answer. It doesn't matter in our setting because most of groups, so think about one group covers 17 states, 150 municipalities. So the winners, they're maximum 2 people per municipality. So it's micro. there is no, but otherwise it's kind of what Thiago said, in equilibrium.
It's a very interesting paper, and I was wondering if how different is it offering housing as offering income, which you were saying that they were offering money for people to have babies so you could possibly afford a house. So I'm thinking that perhaps the selection of those that went to the consortium is really, really big. Those were people who were going to get or have kids at some point, and there are other reasons why fertility rate is going down so much, and one of them is women's education, right? Everybody already knows this story. It's kind of old. And I noticed also that when you showed the effect was really high for people between their 20s, so 20 to 25, so these are women, I think that was the age of the women, right? Because, yeah. So in that case, they're not, most of them, I think, are not going to the university. So because that's the age, right, the school age, the age that people will mostly be in the university. So I think there are other considerations than just saying that if you provide housing credit, then there's going to be, the problem of fertility will be over. I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, but in the paper, because I didn't even read the paper, but I think it's a consideration to make that housing removes one of the frictions, and for those that really want and for different reasons, but there are many other things that are playing out affecting overall fertility.
Yeah, I mean, those are all really good questions, and what you said in the last is exactly what we say in the paper. You can only say what we can say, and then the rest is speculation, right? And I don't know. All those questions are amazing. If we could experiment with those things, I'd be happy to. But we know that cash doesn't really work from other countries. So I think what we need is more like really figure out what are the frictions that people face. Housing is one. That's kind of all we can say. Thanks.
Oh, hey Yanis, congratulations for your presentation. Maybe one of the best I've seen so far, but I haven't seen many. So the thing is, well, I think my question meets my colleagues because I somehow missed the result for an older age group, maybe 25 to 30 or even 30 to 35, because, well, the average age of the first birth has increased a lot. So in a way that, okay, a woman or a couple with 20 to 25 years old that plans to have a child or who gets to get a child in that age, I think they're supposed to have a kid anyhow, regardless of the credit. But I think maybe in the case of Brazil or in the case of the most educated people, I don't know, maybe the 30, for the group from 30 to 35 could be a more suitable group, to target. I don't know, I just missed the result for this particular group.
I mean, we have the results, everything up to 40, you have treatment effect, and then 40 and above. So it's kind of empirical question, what you're saying. You have story, somebody else has another story, so it seems in a net it doesn't matter above 40, even though the wage has gone up. Yeah, that's true, but it's just, it's what we see in the data. We don't take any stance, just what is happening. But we do know the completed, so the argument of, I would have had a child anyway, that's something we very carefully address, and that's not the case. You actually will have less children.
I don't see any more flags up. Any final question? No. So before closing this session, I would like first to thank the audience, not only for the questions that we had, but for attending this great panel. I also would like to congratulate the organization. We know that these 3 great days have started months ago, so it's a lot of people involved in selecting the papers and working hard to have these 3 days up here. So thank you for the teams. You did an amazing job. And at last, I would like to thank our panelists. I must confess, I'm not from the economics department. I'm from supervision, and I'm from market conduct supervision, what deals exactly with the financial protection of our citizens. So I'm very confident to say that what drives our daily decisions and our plans of work and our activities is to improve the life of our financial consumers. So having papers like this, studies that discuss how credit implementations can impact the lives of our citizens, it's incredibly valuable for us. And thank you for your contributions, for your incredible insights, and it indeed helps us to make better decisions. So at last, please join me in giving a big round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you, Juliana. It's very quickly. You put the time is in right time. One quick notice: the working paper award section will be held in the large auditorium opposite this one. So please, we will change the auditorium to attend this last session today, and then we invite everyone to a cocktail party that will be served in the hall. Thank you.
See how